The most common question I get about deliberate cold exposure is how cold should the water be? The second most common question I get about deliberate cold exposure is whether or not cold showers are as good, better, or worse than cold water immersion up to the neck. How cold impacts the brain and body. Temperature is a very potent stimulus for the brain and body. That also means that it carries certain hazards if it's not done correctly. You have a baseline level of temperature that is varying, changing across the 24-hour cycle. So any use of deliberate cold exposure is going to be superimposed on that rhythm, that circadian rhythm, meaning that 24-hour rhythm. The basic contour of your circadian rhythm in temperature is that approximately 2 hours before the time you wake up is your so-called temperature minimum. So your temperature minimum is a time within the 24-hour cycle when your body temperature is at its lowest. So if you normally wake up around 6 a.m., your temperature minimum is probably about 4 a.m. If you normally wake up at about 7 a.m., your temperature minimum is probably about 5 a.m. It's not exactly 2 hours before your wake-up time. It's approximately 2 hours before your wake-up time. As you go from your temperature minimum to the time in which you are going to awake, your temperature is rising slightly. And then at the point where you wake up, your temperature starts to go up more sharply and will continue to go up into the early and sometimes even into the late afternoon. And then sometime in the late afternoon and evening, your temperature will start to decline. And indeed, as you approach sleep, your body temperature will drop by anywhere from 1 to 3 degrees. And in fact, that decrease in core body temperature is important, if not essential, for getting into and staying in deep sleep. That background, or what we call baseline circadian rhythm in core body temperature, is important to remember because it helps us frame both the effects of deliberate cold exposure, and it helps us frame when you might want to use deliberate cold exposure in order to access specific states. It also points to times within the 24-hour cycle when you might want to avoid using deliberate cold exposure if your primary goal is to get to sleep. Many people use deliberate cold exposure specifically to shift their body state as a way to train their mental state so that they can better cope with stress in real life. And by real life, I mean when life presents stressful events. And of course, people are using deliberate cold exposure to reduce inflammation post-exercise, to reduce inflammation generally. What happens when we deliberately expose ourselves to cold? If you are using deliberate cold exposure, environment that you place yourself into should place your mind into a state of, whoa, I would really like to get out of this environment, but I can stay in safely. Okay, now that might seem a little bit arbitrary, but let's say you were to get into a warm shower and it would feel really, really nice, and you were to start turning down the warm and turning up the cold. There would be some threshold at which it would feel uncomfortable to you. And if you were to continue to make a little bit colder than that, you would really want to get out of the shower, but you were confident that you could stay in without risking your health, right? Without risking a heart attack. Now, that's not to scare you away from deliberate cold exposure. It's just to say that there's no simple prescriptive of how cold to make the environment in order to extract maximum benefit for mental or physical performance. So the simple rule of thumb is going to be place yourself into an environment that is uncomfortably cold, but that you can stay in safely. Okay, and you'll have to experiment a bit. And that number, meaning that temperature, will vary from day to day. It will vary across the 24-hour cycle because of that endogenous, meaning that internal rhythm in temperature that I talked about earlier. Low early in the day, rises into the afternoon, drops at night. You can actually do this experiment if you like. Try getting into a cold shower at 11 o'clock at night, if you want, versus try doing it in the middle of the afternoon. It's quite a different experience. And by quite a different experience, I mean it requires quite a different degree of resilience and leaning into the practice. Your willpower will have to be higher, I suspect, late in the day as it compared to early in the day. The most common question I get about deliberate cold exposure is how cold should the water be? And we've answered that with uncomfortably cold to the point where you want to get out, but you can safely stay in. The second most common question I get about deliberate cold exposure is whether or not cold showers are as good, better, or worse than cold water immersion up to the neck. Cold water immersion up to the neck with your feet and hands submerged also is going to be the most effective. Second best would be cold shower. Third best would be to go outside with a minimum amount of clothing, but of course, clothing that is culturally appropriate and that would allow you to experience cold to the point where you would almost want to shiver or start shivering.